Just about a year ago, I set out on the road, seeking my fame and fortune, looking for a pot of gold. Things got bad, and things got worse. I guess you know it's true. Oh Lord, stuck in Lodi again. Now I rode into town with Greyhound. How they want it out if I go. I was just passing through. Must have been 7 months or more. I ran out of town and money. Looks like I took my friend. Oh Lord, stuck in Lodi again.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming today and welcoming you to our home. This was David's home for over 60 years and our home for over 30. It's changed a lot over that time, as I'm sure some of you can see. There are so many projects that he completed here. The bottle wall, the windows over here, this little tiny road that he built to sort of commemorate a tiny little road that we used to walk down in Paris. And also, I'll just point out that patio outside of the greenhouse was really his pride and joy. He did that with cow camp rocks, and the plant is called Elfin Thyme, and it's just a beautiful piece of work. I think anyone who knows David and me would say that we sure had a life. We were together 33 years, since the summer of '89. Paul Cyrack witnessed that first spark up at some event at the Gold Hill Hotel. And a few days later, Wayne Thomas sent us off on a picnic in American Flat down by the stream with some window pane. And saying to us, "There's nothing like a picnic with a girl." He also sang us to sleep every night with his lonesome songs from the back of the cabin where Sam now lives. A year later, my first child and his last was born, and David would now refer to us as a breeding pair with cub. It was almost too much for me to fathom, as I was constantly afraid that I was going to wake up and find that it was a dream. And for him too, it was a surprise and everything he could ask for. It's been another 30-some years of the same. Excitement, love, adventure, fun, ups, downs, and certainly no lack in the range of human emotion. And of course, all the kids, which is my favorite part. David loved parties like this, and with lots of friends, family, and kids running around, and new acquaintances, and he was happy that we started having these parties again year after year. With COVID, we wondered if we were ever going to be able to do it again, and we agreed that if possible, we would have a party on his 86th birthday, and that's tomorrow, but we're having the party today. David got pneumonia last fall. I don't know how many of you know the problems that he was having with his health, but he had lymphoma. He was being treated for that. But once he got pneumonia, he never really recovered from it. He was in the hospital for several weeks, and then he was in rehab to try to regain some strength in his muscles. We hoped for a better outcome, but he spent his last 3 months comfortably at home, where he could work, read, and have good food. And he finished his book, which was an anthology of his writings about Nevada that spans over 50 years, which is available in its second printing now because we sold out the first one. He had been working on that for the last 18 months, and Sam brought us a copy of the book fresh from his printers a week or so before he died, and we paged through it with a bottle of champagne. He was also able to witness that it was selling out before he passed, and he was able to sign a few copies for his friends and family. He wasn't in pain at the end, but the zapping of energy was, as he told me, as bad as it gets. They say you have a surge of energy at the end, and he did. He was insisting that Dave Moore and I go down for a tour of Sutro the next day so that he could put it in the Nevadagram. And we went. And he started asking for special meals like shrimp at home. And Allie was there, and she was able to find the shrimp and steam it for him. Later that day, he mostly slept. But he woke up at one point to tell me that his entire life was playing out before him. I'm seeing my whole life. I'm in Japan. He had spent time in the Navy in Japan when he was 18. It was hard for him to speak, but I think I heard something about Cal a little later. He was seeing it all, and he was okay with it. He died early the afternoon the next day. No pain, just peaceful. And while we'll never be the same without him, we will all be the more enriched for knowing him. I know he would want to be remembered as a devoted father who, despite some odds, stayed in his children's lives with love, care, wisdom, and humor. I think all his kids owe their sense of humor to their dad. He was a good friend and neighbor and defender of the Comstock way of life. And finally, a successful partner and a husband, which he never expected to come along, and neither did I. But we had a great and full life, which continues today with all the children and grandchildren. The family appreciates you coming today. This is certainly a great tribute to a beautiful man. And I want to thank Thomas and Deborah for the video, Darlene for the flowers, Wade and Kay for the banner, and to Mike, Casey, Dale, Cal, and Ralph, and Squeak for the music, and to everyone else for all the wonderful food and drink that you contributed today. There are some family members who want to tell you something about their dad, and then we can hear from friends. And if you're bashful about speaking, Thomas will be off to the side later, and you can go over there and say what you want, and he'll record it. And there's food in the card and billiard room, which is now the dining room. John Toll.
All right, so I've got Ellie here. She's going to keep me brave as we're talking through this stuff. So one of the things that struck me, I'm trying to wrap my hand around, how do you talk about someone like David Toll here on the Comstock? And he was a storyteller. He wasn't necessarily I wouldn't say he was a writer personally. I wouldn't say he was a titan of Nevada tourism, even though he was both of those things. I would say he was a storyteller. And I was just talking to McAvoy about how he used to do this thing with his hand when he would tell a story, and he used to unfurl the story. And it used to be like it was a Harry Potter casting a spell, and everyone in the room was entrapped. And we would all wait to see where it's going, and sometimes it would go snake its way down someplace where we had no idea. And that's where he needed an editor. And Dad's editor in life was Robin. And so let's stop for a second, and everyone please put your hands together and thank Robin for this. So my dad told me one time, I had my first heartbreak, and I said, "Dad, does this ever get easier? Does it hurt less?" And he said, "No, it just hurts different." And he said, "And the other thing I'll tell you is you don't really start living your life until you're 40. I thought for a long time I had it figured out because I started mine at 39. So I was ahead of the game. But what he meant was when he met Robin. So for a lot of us, we know, his life became so much better, and we have so much to thank. We're here today in large part because that partnership was so wonderful, and we have a lot to be thankful for. I'm gonna spend just a moment to talk about the two things that are most important to me about my dad. The first being that I never heard him say an unkind thing about anyone who didn't deserve it. And by didn't deserve it, I have to say it would probably be elected officials and sheriffs were the one outlier, the outliers for that group. But But I'll tell you, we just drove through Nevada. I played, now they have Spotify that plays the 8-track that we used to listen to called Funky Favorites. And my son, I tortured him on the way up here with the same 8-track tape that my dad used to torture me with as we were driving from Tonopah up here. The second thing I would say is really the magic. And this is something that I hope all of us, we leave here today just being grateful for. I see so many faces looking, around here that is just, I am overwhelmed with gratefulness for the fact that my dad introduced all of us together and me to you all. But as I'm thinking about the magic, there was a specific trip to San Francisco that my dad took me on. Robin had an apartment there that was awesome. She had these great toys from Japan that shoot plastic robots, and she had the early Nintendo games, and it was this point in time, and he took me and we walked across San Francisco, and it was very important for him, and as a kid I didn't understand why, but we would pause at Coit Tower and he would tell me the story. And then as we were walking up the hill, because we were headed towards looking at the Golden Gate, a woman dressed in a nun's habit burst forth through the door, and she started singing operatic music. And we stopped for about 2-3 minutes and just listened to her belt out these absolutely beautiful tones. And I looked at him and I was like, "What is going on?" And he squeezed my hand and he said, "This is the magic." And so we kept walking up the hill, and eventually we made it to a place where we were looking over the Golden Gate, and we sat there on the little rock outcrop that was there, and I was a little bored looking at the Golden Gate Bridge. It's not that spectacular, and see it in person, it was absolutely amazing. But a limo pulls up, and these tall, beautiful women spill out of this wearing ball gowns. And then a bunch of what dwarves in tuxedos came out too. And I looked at, and I was 7 or 8, and I looked at it and I said, "Dad, what is going on here?" And he goes, "Son, this is the magic." And so, yeah, I'm with you. So this is the one thing that I hold true, and I talk to my kids about it. There really is magic in this world. My father was, without a doubt, one of the kindest, most loving people that I've ever met and that any of us have ever known. But he had something special, too, where he showed us the magic. He was a storyteller. He used to cast his spells. And I think we all are better off. I know we are all better off from seeing it. There was 8 years later, I was in Romania, and I watched a group of Taiwanese stewardesses all line up in their uniforms, marching in perfect step towards the gate. And my thought was of my father. And I said, that's the magic. So I thank you all for being here today. I thank you all for being part of the magic, because we're all casting the spells. I will tell you, I have seen the beautiful, that shirt, the Hawaiian shirt, I've looked multiple times throughout the day, and I've seen a wisp of my dad. And I keep looking for him, and you know what? He's here. Because this is the magic.
Thanks for that. This is truly a magical experience here today, and John's right. He was a spectacular storyteller, and he, went throughout life looking for and at things and opportunities that were mundanely, amazingly cool. I lived with my dad and my sister Sarah through some of the hardscrabble times. I remember when this was a shack, and it was freezing ass cold in the winter. And when the propane ran out because Westways didn't send their check, we got to experience something that gave us a springboard in life to jump into and to kind of push us in a direction that I think today may be missing in some of our youth. But I got a couple of stories to tell about my dad. So he liked to name his cars. Garbanzo was a 1965 Carmen Ghia. It was absolutely rusted to the bones. I remember driving Garbanzo down at Mound House during a whiteout storm, snowstorm, and almost hitting the road rail on the far left-hand side of the road, realizing that I perhaps should slow down or stop, but also realizing that if I did, I might not get started again. It was freezing ass cold. So Garden Lake, the pickup truck that Robin and my dad enjoyed at the cow camp. There's Ordinaire. I don't remember the car. Ordinaire, Robin? Yeah. The van. Okay, the van, right. You guys passed. Miss Daisy is at my house. I thought the yellow Cadillac would be Miss Daisy, but it's not. It's Buttercup. I remember Rattletrap, a 57 Apache pickup truck that when we drove by Donnie Works and Mary Works and Rose Works' house, of course Don Works, the truck felt like it was going to fall apart and just shake into pieces. He had a 64 Cadillac that Jim Miller Sr. pulled Peter Loeffler, my dad, and myself over at the Delta in Virginia City looking for weed. Under the auspices of having an obscured license plate with the tow bar as the reason for pulling us over, and being just pissed when he found something that might have been a marijuana seed but ultimately turned out not to be. I was astonished because it's like, wow, really? There's no weed in this car? Anyway, the point is that he had a connection with the things around him, and he carried himself in a way that as John said, is magical. I mean, and he recognized those opportunities. He loved this state, and he made a point of, introducing people to it in a way that, that they're mostly not interested in. I know there's a bunch of kids here, but most people think of Nevada as fucking Nevada as they drive through it. And yet, he wanted you to know that, in fact, there is magic almost everywhere in Nevada. It's made me smile to hear John talk about an 8-track tape that he was tortured with driving through. I remember my own personal torture. Dad had an early 70s Toyota station wagon thing that he called Tojo, right? And he did. And Tojo had a cassette tape player, and there was a cassette tape stuck in it. And the only thing that I ever heard during the 2 years that we drove that car was Randy Newman's Sail Away. Okay? When my father passed, I came here and sat with him quietly, or what was left of him, and I sang him that song. I pulled up Apple Music, Spotify, whatever, and I played that song because, and I encourage you to listen to it, and I encourage you to relate to it. But there's a line in there that basically says, hey, we would like to be as happy as a monkey in a monkey tree. And the simplicity and the joy and the times I remember him being as happy as a monkey in a monkey tree it was something that I carried with me. My dad and I was pissed off at my dad for about 10 years, and he did everything in his power to try and bring me back in. He held in Silver City, Casey, the unicorn driver who was playing bass here, he held something called Sam Toll Day. To try and get me off of my, pull the stick out of my behind, and it was a reflection of the amount of love that he had for his kids. But I will say, and I'll reiterate what John said, my dad really loved Robin, and there's this pivot in his life where he, before and after Robin, right? And John and I at one point laughed and said, "Gee, if it wasn't for Robin, he'd be sleeping on our couch." Geez, damn good thing she came in. But he held his grace to the end. And it was really, I think everyone here is a reflection of the kind of person that he was, and the fact that we have so many fond memories of him, hopefully, and we're here together because of him. But I remember, even to the end, and I told this story to Sean when I saw him at the post office once, but recently. But the hospice nurse came in for the first time, and they were giving him a bath, and she was a little awkward, and she said, I need to wash your privates, and he said, "Around here, we refer to those as the lieutenant colonels." Exactly. And that was a reflection of his grace, and knowing that he knew that he was at the final mile, but still having it in him to be who he was. And I'm delighted that I was able to experience a lot of that. I know that, I hope that, and I suspect that you all are as well. I'm super stoked that my son Dalton, my daughter Annabelle, and Mariel should be here. We're able to enjoy their grandfather, and I want to thank everyone for coming today. Thank you very much.
So I wasn't actually going to talk today, but I have to follow up on this because two of the things, it's like a theme. This is 3 generations of kids that had 3 different versions of my dad. Like, we had different lives, different decades, completely different homes, and yet there are themes here that just roll right through. I spent a couple summers up at the mining building up here with my dad, where we lived in literally an empty mining building. And I had one tape and one tape deck, and I listened to the Beatles' White Album over and over and over for a whole summer long, and it set me up for a nice rounded musical version of myself. And the other one is the magic. I was actually writing some words that I wanted to say, and what I came up with was that my whole life, this house and my dad have been the one thing that I knew were always here. No matter where in the world I was, no matter what was happening in my life, I knew that I had this place that was always super magical. And what I'm realizing now is really the magic was my dad. It really wasn't this house. It wasn't Gold Hill. It wasn't the Comstock, but it was my dad. So I know he'd be super happy to see everybody here today. And thank you guys for coming. He would love to see it.
Nevada has lost a favorite son, and the world has lost a sage. David Toll was the SS Tahoe, the V&T Railroad, the CC Mint incarnate. To know David was to know Nevada. For in his love for the Silver State, in his writings, in his lifestyle, he left not one town, not one event, not one Nevada stone unturned. By his own admission, David's proudest semi-professional accomplishment was to start a newspaper with no money in a ghost town. And he made a success of it. David's Gold Hill News was the best little paper in the West, earning numerous awards, including his favorite, a bag of groceries from one of Nevada's finest patrolmen, with the words, "We know what you are trying to do, and we hope you succeed." Thanks in large part to Robin and their loving family, David got his last book published shortly before being called home. David Toll's Nevada. it could as easily have been entitled Nevada's David Toll. About Nevada's wild horses, David writes, "I took a few clumsy steps as if to follow, not so much thinking I could catch them, but because they were so almighty beautiful that I ached to run along with them." David did run with Nevada's wild horses. He was a man of extraordinary grace of person, manners, and gentle goodwill. Like you, I feel enormous grief, but also feel honored to have lived in the same century as David, to have been privy to his uncanny insight and indelible humor. Mark Twain would have called him a regular brick. David was the muscle and bone of the great state of Nevada. It is not an exaggeration to say David was Nevada personified. His portrait should hang in the Nevada State Archives, framed in sagebrush. Nevada was born of Native Americans. Then came Kit Carson and David Toll. He who was champion of Nevada, caretaker of the Comstock lode, and sovereign of all he surveyed. The minister of truth, the likes of which, as his kids characterize his magic, has never been seen before and shall never be seen yet again. A Nevada son, he kept his grit, his gravitas, and his grace to the very end. May he rest in eternal peace. Our forever friend, David Toll.
Is there anybody else who wants to come say something? Oh, Cynthia. Cynthia Kennedy.
David Toll. 18 years ago, David Toll first came to Gold Hill. He was a boy of 8 when the Virginia Range took him into her arms, her sage fragrance embracing and warm. My memories of the Comstock, great-grandfather Gorham penned. David heard all these tales and decided that when he grew up, he'd be back in Mount Davidson's shadow, writing his own books. He'd never outgrow the seeds Harry planted those years long ago. John P. Jones Mansion became his home. The senator, a muse in that house, David was never alone. Wives, children, great-grandchildren, babies and friends, dogs, manuscripts, books, mementos, prolific artwork, all lent the atmosphere needed to write of this state. The complete Nevada traveler came from a dictate of the governor, no less. David, right of the mountains, the deserts, the lakes, the tumbling towns, the highways and trails, casinos and ranches, write it all down. While his Gold Hill News revived history past and made some of its own with issues that grasped the newsmaking world of Nevada's free press, awards were forthcoming and many amassed on the shelves filled with the dust in the senator's manse. But news and articles of present day were pushed from his mind when Squaw Tom spoke and said, "Write of me and my time. Let the desert rat speak." David heard him and yarn spilled out of his pen, a book that was born from a long-battled friend. Another strange man, a pimp, some would say. Joe Conforti would live in Toll's head for long days of bombastic interviews, breaks brains and balls, Only David could write of that Sicilian's downfall. David's here now. He's raising a glass. He's hoping you'll buy a tank full of gas. Visit a town, one you've never seen, in Nevada, the glorious battle-born state that David so loved and made him so great.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Anybody else? Michael.
Michael, beat up Michael.
Oh, I didn't write anything down. I met the breeding pair when they embarked on their house addition. And I met David then, and he has been my good friend since. And him and I have had many wonderful laughs and time spent talking about obscure things that were fun and meaningful, and even if we had counterpoint, it was always interesting, and he made it fun and he made it interesting, and he always had a story. David always had a story about something. One that he told me that amused me. He was in Europe, and he was, I think, in Transylvania or somewhere like that. He had himself some realistic-looking fangs, and he said he picked a dark corridor, and he got over in the corridor where nobody could see him, and he slipped on his overcoat and he put these fangs in, and he waited for some tourist to walk by, and he went, "I'm Dracula!" And he said he got the most fun out of that. It was the best thing he did in the whole trip. I love David, and we would often have cocktails together in the evening, and we created a drink. It was a gin giblet, but we called it a Jim Gibbons because for some reason it just became that. But I'm gonna miss you. I'm gonna miss him. Gonna miss you, buddy. Thank you all for coming here. He was a great friend and a great person. Lived his life the way he called it. He was a good father, husband, friend, and just a good, true, and right person. God bless you, David.
It was about 1972 when I first met David. We were out, somehow we had ended up out in Tonopah for Jim Butler days. And after Jim Butler days was over, we kind of hooked up, myself and a guy by the name of John Miles, driving a 59 Fairlane, I think it was, or Ranchero, and David was in the car in front of us with John Lundemo, and I don't remember what they were driving or who was driving, but we ended up out in first at Diana's Punch Bowl, and then at Belmont. And then we went from Belmont back into Tonopah, where David introduced me to a guy named Murph. Okay, Murph ended up writing for David for the Gold Hill News, and it worked out to be a perfect gig for Murph and for David, because David got free articles from Murph, and Murph lived with me. So we go back a long ways, and I'm going to miss him. He was a great human being, a great American, a great Nevadan, and I will miss him. Thanks.
Wait, I have something to say.
Come on. Here comes Allie.
Oh, no.
I don't speak in front of people, but my dad really liked it when I did. So there you go. Enjoy the party. And here's Mojito and Gigi. Sean, you coming up? Yeah.
So I'm not coming up to say anything. I'm coming up for our late friend who would want to say something, Paul Cyrac. You know, Paul and David went back as long as I can remember, and I know that David invigorated Paul's life in ways I'll never be able to describe. I can't tell you the number of days and nights I went to Paul's house. He was awake at the computer trying to define what David had just sent him, and he couldn't understand it. Trying to make sense of the maps, trying to make sense of the atlases, trying to make sense of the books, the narratives, the hundreds and hundreds of stories. I know they had a tempestuous relationship, but if Paul were here, he would tell you he was the man that gave him the most meaning in his life. And I say that unequivocally. All of you know Paul, and you know what an incredible thing they did for each other. They gave each other magic that wasn't available anyplace else. And that's why they did this crazy stuff called making books. Because you have to be crazy to make books. I make them, I know that. You have to be crazy. And they did it out of love. And that's the only reason to do anything. So here's to both of them.
Being a transplant from San Francisco in 1982, I've only been here 40 years, so it doesn't really count. And I knew David from his books before I met the actual physical David, and there was really no comparison because the books are okay, but he was so full that only a little bit of it trickled out into words. And I enjoyed his company. I was here quite a few times. One time it was with Louis Beaupre's daughter, who catered a meal for some event, and I also knew Louis and went drinking with Louis Beaupre in downtown, well, mostly in Virginia City. And my only claim to fame other with David is I was a clamper longer than he was.
All right.
53 years and counting.
Good afternoon. I'm a bit of an interloper. I don't know too many of you, actually very few. And I only knew David for probably about 6 years, if that. I'm a boomer. I've worked for the railroad, and I grew up in the city. I grew up in Baltimore. I've lived in Milwaukee, Seattle, Tucson, Chicago, and I came out here from Chicago in 2006 chasing an Amtrak job. And I met Larry Steinberg, who some of you may know, who used to live down in Silver City. And then I met Guy Rocha. And then I met David Toll. And these are my three mentors, because I landed in Nevada and it's like, where in the hell am I? And these three brothers understood the labor movement, they understood the working class, they understood work, and they certainly understood the state of Nevada, and I didn't. And they welcomed me into their lives. And with David, it was actually quite phenomenal. I literally cannot remember how in the hell I met David Toll. I literally cannot remember. But I think it might have been Tom Gray from the railroad. And I remember meeting with David, who I had no idea who he was, and Tom at the Ponderosa or somewhere. And we talked about trains. And we were going to do something about trains in the state of Nevada. And then we went to the Halfway Club, and David Fenimore, who was here earlier, who was a student of David's back in the 70s and worked for the Gold Hill newspaper. David told me afterwards, he goes, I can't believe it. I haven't seen David Toll in like 40 years. And so David and I and David were supposed to get together, I think, with a few other people who I didn't know who also worked for the Gold Hill News. And that was going to happen. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. But anyway, I owe so much to David for teaching me about this, my new home state, which I never in my wildest dreams growing up in Baltimore in the city would have thought I'd be living out here in the wilds of Nevada. So anyway, thank you very much, David Toll.
So I was working and living in Gabbs in the early and mid 70s, and this dude from Michigan came in and he wanted to know about Nevada, so he bought the first complete Nevada Traveler, and when he left, he gave it to me. And so 25 years later, I meet David, and I was like, man, you know, what's the secret of your youth? And he told me wine, marijuana, and I can't say the other one. But anyway, some of the stories that I have about David are, about half about Robin. Like, they brought an entourage down to Hawthorne to see McVeigh Lane do the Mark Twain. And so we had a party at my shop, and we had a fire out there with a wash tub, and everybody got a kick out of that. And so the next morning, there was Robin and I up at our local landfill busting apart a washing machine so that she could have one herself. And then one of my other ones is, they were always real adventuresome, and myself too. And so I'm on my way to Bonneville, north, or if it's east or north of Eureka, taking this dirt road, and this dude says, "Hey, when you get out there and you get to the man camp, turn right." And so we go past all these trailers. We didn't, it's like, we didn't know what a man camp was. And so we end up in I think it's the Overland Trail. And there's this bug dust out there. I mean, this stuff is like golden metal flour, and it's 3 feet deep. And we're going through it in a 4-wheel drive, and it's coming over my hood. And so a week or so later, David comes through, and he's telling this story about him and Robin they're taking an empty keg back to the Ruby Valley Brewery, and they take the same trail as I in a Prius. And poor Robin had to walk out to the good road and find some good Samaritan to come in there and yard him out of there. So anyway, I've had a great time, and thank you.
Allie made me do it. It's purple.
Always fun.
So I've known David Toll my whole life, and one of the reasons that I'm up here is not because I have anything particularly special to say, but because I know that every single person who is here had a unique relationship with David and had something special or magical, whether it was a conversation, a moment, an evening, that changed something in how they thought about the world, and maybe informed who they became. And for me personally, I knew David as a small child. I knew him as a member of the Silver City Guard, his crazy hats and his outfits. And I also knew him as the publisher of the Gold Hill News, as I knew him because I was friends with his kids. You're supposed to be up here. And so we played here. We played on Peanut Butter Hill till our shoes were covered and we had to scrape it off and then run down again. And also, I worked for him, and when I got older, I worked for him in Gold Hill Publishing, and he would bring the check in and say, "Okay, take this up to the bank." And I'm like, "Okay." He's like, "Pay yourself first, and then let's talk about who's going to get paid." I'm like, "Okay, I'm on it." So I would go and write out that check for myself first every month when we got paid. These were the hard times before he met Robin. And I also remember distinctly that he told me that he woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning to write. And that has always stayed with me. And to me, what that meant was, if you want to do something special or something different or something better than the average, going to work, working your 40, you got to get up early and you got to do it while everybody's still asleep. And that's always stuck with me. I also worked for him later on as I babysat many of his fabulous children. I was lucky enough to babysit John and Allie and Chris, and that was always a great honor. And I also worked for him. I had a house cleaning business, and he was one of my clients. So I kind of did organization and redialing an entire house before that was a thing, and part of it started here. So really, this place is the impetus for a lot of other kinds of magic that happen in the world. But I think most importantly for me, I watched David as a kid and growing up, and someone who, when he just did things. When he wanted to do something, he just went out and did it and tried it. And the Gold Hill News and all of the magic that they brought to all of the people that we knew, and different people got to write for it, different people got to be photographers. Oh, and Jimmy Crandall says he's sorry he couldn't make any little COVID scare there, so he was planning on being here today. So, and that this was the story of us and our community and all of the characters and the hijinks, and that you could write and you could publish, and the things that we did were actually interesting. So that was a huge lesson, and I think that in the background of my mind as I went on to do other things in my life, I really truly believe that that has informed who I became as a professional. And I was lucky enough in my work at the State Museum to have David come down and give a lecture on the Gold Hill News at the Nevada State Museum, and I felt honored that he said yes and came and spoke. So many blessings, David. You've brought so much to all of our lives, and I know that every single person here has a David story, so I'm not unique, so come on up and tell it.
I'm Evangeline Elston, and my sister was born in this house, and I've known this family my whole life, and David was a huge part of my life. Not all the time, but definitely a foundational person for me. My dad just told me today that my sister's placenta is buried on that peak. I vaguely remember that story, but I was like, okay, thanks, Dad, for that. Anyway, my mom and dad were here earlier and they left, but my dad asked me to just say that, you know, he really loved David for his literacy and his humor and his kindness. And those things are just so much David, and they held their friendship together for close to 60 years. And I have some of the best friends of my life because of his children, Sarah and Sam and all the others that came after, but those are the ones that I grew up with. And Robin is one of the coolest people and the people I look up to the most in this world. She's an incredible cook, and I aspire to that. And it's sad that David's gone.
Okay, well, as I said, Thomas will be taking anybody else's stories that you want to tell. And we have lots of dessert, so I hope everyone will partake.
Hi, I'm Kristen McCormick. My claim to fame with David Toll is we lived in Reno. My dad was an art professor at UNR, and somehow they all got together through Synanon, or I don't know. I was very young. And David would take his daughter, Sarah Toll, who became and still is one of my best friends, in the Frito-Lay truck up and down the roads, and he let us sit on the bottom step driving around Reno. Okay, so imagine that feeling as these probably 5 or 6 year old little girls. I moved to Silver City when I was 7, so that's when I got hooked back up with the Toll family, all of them, and stuck with all of them, and babysat the children, and he's just near and dear to my heart. He is one of the fathers. Okay, and one more story. David, Jan, and I were here in this house, David's house, and he brought up the question, if you had another name, Kristen, what would it be? I was 8 years old. I was cleaning their house. And I said, I would name myself Chisel. And he said, why would you name yourself Chisel? And I said, because I'm so smart. And so from then on, him and Jan Maximova would call me Chisel. There.
My name is David Fenimore, and I don't remember exactly how I first met David Toll. I must have been barely 24 years old and working in Kings Beach, California at the radio station KSML that brought me to the area in 1974. It could have been a college friend of mine, Terry Seelinger, who was living in Silver City at the time. Or it could have been just hanging out at the Golden Gate Saloon, listening to Sutro Symphony Orchestra. For whatever reason, however I met David, he invited me to be the Gold Hill News' North Shore correspondent. And this was a very generous and encouraging offer for, as yet unpublished writer as I was. I remember I would always type my stories on random lengths of teletype paper torn from the Reuters Newswire machine at the radio station that had been installed at the insistence of another legendary Comstocker, Chandler Travis T. Hip Laughlin. I'd always deliver my copy in person, and I remember standing in the musty old Gold Hill News offices while David Moore marked up my copy, and I learned a lot about writing from that. And then when the workday was done and the sun was setting behind Mount Davison, we would usually repair to some local watering hole, and after a brew or two, David would let his hair down and talk about, among other things, his financial woes. I remember him saying once, "Every issue hurts us a little bit more." As a North Shore correspondent, he encouraged me to write about anything and everything. I wrote about the sled dog races and the balloon races in Truckee, about Tahoe City's Snowfest. I interviewed the Forest Service fire spotter Lane Endicott, who had first seen the Donner burn take off in 1960 from her perch up on Verdi Peak. I profiled the local search and rescue team. I wrote about my pet goat. I wrote about my fledgling homebrew beer operation. And when the Gold Hill News, not because of anything I contributed, was to be honored with a couple of awards from the Nevada State Press Association, a whole bunch of us piled into my old green Datsun pickup, and some of us in the cab, some of us in the bed, set out across Highway 50, stopping at every roadhouse on the way. I remember we started off at a surprisingly early hour with gin and tonics at the International Hotel in Austin. When we arrived in Ely, we all went to the banquet there at the Prospector Hotel Casino, and I remember drinking way more than a 20-something ever had before in his very short life. Next morning, I was taking a turn down the sidewalk to clear my head, and who should I run into but David Toll. I pointed to a nearby saloon that happened to be open. "Hair of the dog," I suggested. "Hair of the dog, indeed," said he, and we strode on in together. One time, at the behest of his then-wife, Andrea, who thought that it would be good for David's nerves, I brought the essential pieces of my home brewing equipment over to the Jones Mansion, and there, over a gallon or two of cheap Chianti, David and I boiled up the wort, pitched the yeast, and initiated the primary fermentation of a batch of ale, which Andrea evidently believed would contain beneficial quantities of vitamin B12. David's conclusion was, it takes a lot of wine to make beer. Well, the 1970s drifted into the 80s, and I became consumed with my first marriage and many other matters, but David and I kept in touch for a while, even after finances forced him to cease publication of the Gold Hill News. The last time I saw David, in 2019, we met at a coffee shop near UNR to talk about getting him an undergraduate intern from the English department where I taught, to help out with the Nevadagram, the successor to the Complete Nevada Traveler, which I had used for decades as my guide exploring far-flung corners of the Silver State. I discovered the Valley of Fire. It was very cold that day, and my wife and I shivered there and read David's words, "Step out of your car, feel the heat." Brr. I discovered Cathedral Gorge, places like Belmont Mill, and the obscure monument commemorating a 1938 angelic visitation to Maurice Glendenning, founder of the Mormon splinter group, the House of Aaron. This monument, which sits atop Hancock Summit between Rachel and Pioche on the extraterrestrial highway. I mean, who who else would have known about that? Thank you, David, and rest in peace.
Okay.
Silver City Guard.
Well, the Silver City Guard, we're really going to miss David. David was a lead character in the Guard. I don't know what rank he held, but we were all ranked. So, this is for David. We miss you.
Thanks for having me. This is very special. I feel honored. I think it goes without saying that David Toll was a unique human being. But more than that, David was somebody, not just anybody. He was a pillar in our community, the cornerstone of the house we call the Comstock. And David was a complex guy with more facets than the Jim that he was. He had that, let's say, je ne sais quoi. He was a storyteller, a tireless writer, aesthetician, father, husband, traveler, charmer, and we all know he was a lover of Nevada. His life seemed to be scripted, and he played the character to a T. And I feel so fortunate to have known him and shared some time with him over the last, 4 decades. But unbeknownst to me, until fairly recently, I shared some space with David and his wife at the time, Susan Stornetta. And that was in 1968 in San Francisco, long before actually meeting him. One day, during a conversation with Susan Stornetta, she told me it was likely that David and her lived in the same flat that I had just described to her. But to confirm this, I needed a plan, so a plan was hatched with Robin and Susan's help. Robin would have a dinner, which she does regularly. Guests would include Susan, Jim Allender, Joy, I believe Donald Dickerson, and myself. During the lovely meal, Susan and I conspired, excuse me, to steer the conversation towards San Francisco, knowing David's affinity for the city by the bay. We began the conversation in North Beach. We marched down Grant Street, reminiscing past the Cafe Trieste, pausing at Big Al's to oogle Carol Doda's twins before crossing Broadway. I live just around the corner from Big Al's at number 1 Romulo Street, I said. And having crossed Broadway, we passed Lauren Ferlinghetti's City Lights, then past the Hungry Eye before continuing east on Lower Grant Street, past Sammy Woe's and deep into Chinatown. The fly was cast and perched on the water. I lived in Chinatown, pipes Dave, near the Stockton Street Tunnel. I was working then at a radio station in San Francisco, a KOL something or another. Really, I said. My girlfriend at the time lived by the Stockton Street Tunnel as well. Imagine that. So I went on to describe some unique features of the flat, the empty lot between it and the tunnel. It was on Sacramento Street. The back porch, which opened to a jungle of a yard, complete with banana tree. It also featured a subterranean room with a sidewalk level window, which opened onto Sacramento Street. David began looking at that fly perched on the water, pondered its authenticity, then erupted. You just described our flat. I lived there too. I remember that window. The cacophony of Mandarin and Chinese dialect, as if they're always mad and screaming at one another. Their shoes as they passed by, their ankles, their pant legs. It was lovely. I got you, David. Yeah. The magic. In 1969, while I was still living in San Francisco, I came to the Comstock to visit my friend Michael Clark. He and Wayne Thomas, who I had met a few months prior, were apparently house sitting for David, who wasn't there at the time. Most of the evening was spent in what has been David's office for the last several decades, huddled by the wood stove listening to Michael and Wayne weave their magic with tunes like Hard Times and Boiled Coffee, Burnt Toast, and You. The magic. In 1974, I couldn't resist and moved to Silver City. They were just having too much fun up there. There were so many talented folks, interesting folks coalescing there. Cowboys, cowgirls, Native Americans, artists, writers, storytellers, craftsmen, students, professors, archaeologists, gangsters, actors. They were all here. It was a microcosm. There were 2 bars for refreshments, and for our entertainment, perpetual music was provided by the Sutro Sympathy Orchestra. Hallmark holidays, weddings, funerals were always presided over by the Silver City Guard, of which David was a ranking officer and flag bearer. Silver City also had a fine dining restaurant, Lewis and Clark's, hosted by Louis Beaupre and Click Slocum. The Comstock seemed to be the center of the universe, and the nucleus of that universe was the Gold Hill News, headed up by Dave Toll and his staff of locals, all talents in their own right. I remember looking forward to each edition, not just for the news that mattered, but for the cover art, which was always superb, whether it was Buckeye Blake's, Dan Murray's, Joanne Johnson's, Kenny Uhas's, Steve Saylor. The Gold Hill News introduced us to a cast of local characters also. Squaw Tom, Joe Comforti, Lucius Beebe, to name a few. Letters to the editor were also generally humorous and sardonic. It was about this time that I met David, and we've been friends ever since. And our friendship just grew larger and larger with each passing year. So about that banana tree. During a design session for his and Robin's edition, David said he'd like to grow a banana tree in the grand room. So the ceiling height needed to accommodate the height of a mature banana tree, which I'm assuming was 20, 30 feet tall. So that's what we did. The banana tree never materialized, but the yuccas that are there are at home, and they are reaching for the ceiling. But later in life, during that design session, he reminded me of the banana tree in San Francisco, and that's why he really wanted to have it, just as a reminder. David also needed a large wall for his vintage Welcome to Carson City metal sign that had been shot up at one time by vandals. It wasn't until lit that the average eye could see inscribed by .45 caliber bullets the word, "Fuck you." More of Dave's magic. David always thought on a grand scale, and he always envisioned his rubbled yard being transformed into a Parisian park with a wave of his hands. And damn if he and Robin didn't make that happen. And before his passing, he completed the Rue de Prévost, his final brushstroke on the Parisian park. Magic. In remembering his father, his son John used the word, the magic. I get it. That's why I plagiarized it. And I believe all of us who know David have experienced and maybe, hopefully, gleaned a little or a lot of his magic. See you by the river, my friend. Your pal Bo.